this presentation, now that you've thought a little bit about interculturality and about how you might connect into career pathways, we're going to talk a little bit about collaboration and project management and how we might start setting up our project in a way that manages it well for students. So as we think about PBLL, gold standard PBLL has at its core the idea of authenticity. And as I'm sure you all are quickly discovering, if you hadn't already been aware of this, authenticity and 21st century skills are key pieces of real life, but real life is very complex, and that creates a lot of cognitive overload for our students, which in turn leads to breakdowns in their ability to complete the project tasks and to move forward with their target language development. So as we think about how we might support students, those breakdowns actually become our friends, because the breakdowns help us to identify where and what type of supports that we need to put in place. So we're going to think a little bit in this session about how movies can help us to think through scaffolding project management for our students. And we'll address that in terms of these three questions. What do real-life PBLL and movies have in common? How filmmakers guide audiences through complex content? And how our experiences at the movies can help us think about structuring PBLL. By the end of the session, hopefully you'll be able to identify some key components of successful immersive experiences, which I think is an interesting way to think about project-based language learning. And you'll be able to employ some scaffolding strategies to effectively facilitate that. So think about the last time you went to the movies. What are some of the things that you experienced? And as we move through this, feel free to make comments in chat about these things. And more specifically, I'm particularly interested in which movies have influenced you most and why those movies had such a powerful impact on you. And the idea here is that both movies and project-based language learning are, or should be if we're doing them well, immersive experiences that completely, we become so involved in them that in some ways we lose track of everything else around us, which is essentially the idea of engagement, right? That we want students to be so engaged or to put students in flow that they are completely focused on the experience. Now, just like teachers, filmmakers only have about 2 hours to cover everything, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but they are really constrained by time. If you think about it, the director, or more specifically the filmmaker, has to explain the structure, the culture, and the rules of whatever world they're inviting you to visit. They have to connect with the audience in ways that help them to learn the language of the world. They have to introduce and develop each individual character, backstory, and set of motivations. They have to teach relevant disciplinary concepts. So for example, if I am watching a movie about science fiction, I have to learn certain things about science in order to understand the movie. They have to clarify the conflicts that are in play, progressively develop the plot, resolve problems, and end the movie in an intellectually satisfying way and an emotionally satisfying way. In other words, they have to do what teachers have to do. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from filmmakers about how to create meaningful experiences for our students given our time constraints. And the key thing that movie makers have figured out is how to select which parts of real life, which parts of reality they immerse us in. They give us bite-sized chunks of complexity. The other thing that is really hard for language teachers to do that filmmakers are very good at is that meaningful movies do teach things, but they don't generally explain. They show more than tell. They support our ability to think about what we are seeing. They evoke a lot of emotion. They guide our attention very purposefully, and they get us to reflect and to desire to take some sort of action. The best movies do. This means a couple of things for us. First of all, it means that we may not necessarily need to put everything linearly. I think sometimes we're afraid of teachable moments, but in PBLL, there will be lots of opportunities for us to stray a little bit from our quote-unquote lesson plan. And so thinking more in terms of how can I structure the classroom environment in such a way that when a particular small group or set of students has a question, I'm free to go facilitate or answer or work with them around that question instead of holding up the entire class. And that means that we have to think more thoughtfully about how we're going to structure the experience. Movies use the setting to convey a lot of the information. And so Stephen gave us some really great ideas about how we might use principles of interculturality in the background of what we're designing so that we provide students with opportunities to interact with that cultural context. Movies use interpersonal communication, or in other words, the costumes, the dialogues, and the action to develop characterization. So in a language class, they need lots of opportunities to communicate. They use multimedia and multisensory methods and materials. And they really think about, movie makers really think about looking at things from multiple perspectives. They guide our attention by the kinds of action that occurs in the movie, the camera angles, and the close-ups. So from a language teacher's perspective, we need to think about what are we going to have learners doing? From whose perspective are they viewing or doing those things? And how are we going to guide their attention to what is critical for them to understand? And then movies also provoke personal reflection. And I'm going to let you read through some of these things on your own in the modules. So if our goal is that our students are going to be able to take their language skills and use them to accomplish things that are of interest to them in ways that contribute to the world, then how do we structure the experience? And how do we make sure that they enjoy it as we're working with them? We're going to look at some specific things now that are a little more classroom focused. As we're thinking about scaffolding collaboration, a lot of teachers think exclusively about the language. And we will spend all three modules next time talking about how to scaffold each of the modes of communication. But for today, we're going to focus more on physical space, routines and procedures, and scaffolding content and cognition. So when we think about scaffolding the physical space, movie theaters have figured out that physical arrangement guides movement. They use very clear routines and procedures to help minimize confusion. They minimize distractions, and the seating supports the kinds of behaviors and interactions they want the audience to engage in. Relevant resources and materials such as popcorn or candy are easy to access. Bathrooms, and there are clear processes provided for what it is that we're supposed to be doing. So if you think about the very moment you start into a movie theater, the physical structure forces you to move in one direction or another. And it's very clear where the lines start and things of that nature. In a similar way, teachers need to think very carefully about how they are setting up their classroom environment and how they are setting up the logistics of the project. If we set it up well, then a lot of the things that make teachers afraid to try PBLL, specifically the idea that, oh, my classroom is going to be out of control and how can I have students doing 15 different things at once and so on and so forth. If we have set up the flow of the project and the processes carefully, students will manage themselves to some degree, or rather the environment will manage the students for us. So elementary teachers are well aware of this, and they are very good at setting up the organization and furniture in their classrooms to guide movement through the space. They demarcate specific areas for specific types of tasks. Now, obviously at the university level, we don't always have that option, but we can use clear routines and procedures to eliminate confusion instead. And we've talked a little bit about seating. I am always amazed, so I teach at a university, and this is generally what the classrooms look like. And I'm always amazed that every single one is continuously positioned in rows. It doesn't matter what time of day or night I go into the classroom, everything is always in rows. And yet we know that if we want students in a language classroom to interact successfully, we should be thinking a little bit more about how we're setting up the space to facilitate that. So if I want students to be working in pairs, it's helpful to seat them in pairs or have them drag their desks into pairs, ideally facing one another if they're supposed to be collaborating. This is a good example of small group work, and you can see in the upper right-hand corner how the teacher has organized the desks. Now this teacher happens to be lucky and has flat desks, so that students can successfully see each other and all see the product that they are creating. Thinking about, are there other places in the school or in the university or in the hallways where we could take students so that they can accomplish whatever task we're asking them to do? So if I'm asking them to analyze or to look for something specific out of a bunch of newspapers, for example, can we shift where we are having class so that they can accomplish that task? Things like whole class discussion or debate. So putting tables in a horseshoe or desks in a circle, or finding other rooms. This particular room happens to be one that I have access to where I can schedule students to go down and have group kinds of collaborative activities. Are we making the resources and materials they need for whatever we've asked them to do easy to access? This sounds really simple, but it is amazing to me how much time and confusion I can eliminate by thoughtfully thinking through how I am storing, packaging, and distributing materials to students. And making sure that things are already set up so that there's a Ziploc bag or a Tupperware container filled with the supplies and materials they might be needing. And then establishing clear routines and procedures for group interactions. We're going to look at specific examples of scaffolding sheets for each of these. And we'll start here with the idea of scheduling the project as a whole. So one thing that a lot of teachers do when they start PBLL for the first time is they'll work all the way through the different project tasks, and then they realize, oh, I have to schedule the final presentation or culminating event or product, and now we're running out of time. So one really key thing in planning project-based language learning is to plan backwards. Think of it just like a movie theater. So a movie theater figures out what is going to be the opening night or the premiere night of the particular movie that's going to be shown. And then they start advertising that well in advance, which we will need to do if we're going to be working with authentic audiences for that event. Then they start very carefully by setting expectations for the project. So just like in a movie theater, you get the little advertisements that tell us to be quiet and turn off our cell phones. We need to set up similar processes and procedures for our students in terms of when you're in groups, these are the behaviors I expect to see. When you're in groups, these are the things that are not appropriate. And that applies to adults as well. Generating interest in the project. So once you've sort of set up the general framework, then thinking about what is your entry event, is the term we use in PBLL, going to be. How are you going to get the audience to start paying attention to, or not the audience specifically, but your students? How are you going to capture their attention in the project? How are you going to stimulate their curiosity about whatever the topic of inquiry is? And most importantly most important are these last two. How are you going to stimulate their questions and elicit their need to knows? You'll see over here on the right a worksheet that's designed to kind of help you think through creating an entry event. So you see in the table a list of possible events that you might select from, things that tend to be likely to capture attention or stimulate interest or generate questions. And you can go through and highlight those. And then think about additional ideas that you might have. Choose a few different events to consider. Now that might seem a strange thing, like why would I want to waste my time looking at 2 or 3 events when I could just quickly pick one and move on? But a lot of times as you consider multiple options, the options will inform and influence one another, and what you'll finally end up with is kind of a synthesis of those options that's much more powerful than what you would have come up with before. Then we need to think about forming student groups. And so that's where we start thinking about how a movie director might think in terms of a casting call. So if I am looking for casts, I'm looking for people with specific skills. And I can guide students through this kind of a process by asking them to read each of these statements, which I would put in the target language. Having them list, who do they think of first? What about one of their friends? And then is there somebody they don't know well? Now those last two columns are particularly important in classes where the students might have spent a lot of time together or might be inclined to just choose their friends. Because in the work world, a lot of times we are working with people because of their skill set, not because they are necessarily our best friend. And so helping students to sort of sort through that by building it into the scaffolding can avoid things like a group of friends, none of whom have the skills to accomplish whatever the project tasks are. Then we need to think about how we're going to plan for individual and group accountability. So if you think about a movie, typically the actors are responsible each for their own parts, but they also have to work collaboratively in order to make the scene come off successfully. And so we want to build in some processes that will help students to think about that as well. So I might use a worksheet like this one where they are going to list their team members. Then they are going to rate their team using the criteria that I have listed there. So have we introduced ourselves to one another? You would be surprised how many students will start group work and not even think to tell each other their names. Do we know which aspect, that's particularly true in middle school and high school. Do we know which aspect of the project we're going to work on today? So helping students to recognize that their workflow is going to change from day to day depending on what needs to happen in order to move the project forward. Helping them to set goals for what they're going to accomplish. And I would probably add to this scaffolding sheet as I revise it, a place for them to write what that daily goal is. Have they decided what they need to learn, what their need to knows are in order to complete their task? And have they divided up the responsibilities? And then by the end, you'll notice I've started thinking about proficiency here in numbers 6 through 9. So what is it that we all know how to do? What can we describe and explain? What can we narrate? What can we state an opinion about? And obviously you would change those depending on your linguistic goals for the class. Then we want to schedule our tasks. So just like a movie tells you, or a movie theater tells you when each of the things are showing, you're going to want to be thinking about when those tasks are going to occur and to think about progressively developing understanding through the project, just like a script progressively develops the audience's understanding of what's going on in the movie. We want to make sure we give very clear instructions. So this formula is based around the idea of short-term memory and that most adults can only keep in mind about 7 chunks of information. So putting each step of instruction on a separate line with no more than 5 steps and no more than 7 to 10 words per step, depending on your language. It's a challenge to do this, even in English, but you will find that it dramatically changes what students are able to accomplish. For this last section, I just want to kind of quickly show you a variety of different types of scaffolding, and then we'll go into these in more detail in the next webinar. So one major thing that teachers forget to think about is how to scaffold cognition. We scaffold the doing, but we don't scaffold the thinking. And when project-based language learning breaks down, and also when the language breaks down, often it is directly related to the fact that we have not scaffolded the thinking process. That's probably one of the most important things I could say to you today. So all of these things on the right are things that we need to scaffold, believe it or not. So we need to have procedures for how we're going to have them do creative things like brainstorming or capturing and prioritizing their ideas or evaluating and implementing their ideas. We need guidelines for class discussion. We need ways to scaffold brainstorming and problem solving, and there are a lot of tools that will help us to do that. So for example, this particular tool allows students to start, it allows me to post a question, It allows students on the left to start posting their ideas in response to the question. And then it allows the class to collaboratively generate a list of pros and cons regarding that particular idea. And they can vote on the ideas. And so this is a great way for students to be carefully scaffolded through the process of brainstorming, analyzing, and prioritizing project ideas, for example. You can use non-technology options as well. So I can have students using Post-it notes that are different colors to generate their ideas. And I can use Post-it notes to sequence ideas or to generate evidence or task lists for each of the tasks listed at the top. I can have students use Post-its to compare and contrast. I need to scaffold decision making. So if I'm going to ask them to do something like create a board game, I can't just say, okay, get in your groups and make your game. I need to help them think through what are the kinds of games that you've ever played and what makes them fun to play. And as you think about those games, how are they structured? What are their themes? What are the different elements that your game is going to include? Will it be game pieces or markers or timers or what? And provide examples. I need to scaffold, have processes in place for helping them to scaffold synthesizing ideas. And I can give them sentence frames, which we'll talk more about next time for that. And then I need to scaffold their critique and revision. So giving them opportunities to think about how well, for example, let's say that we're doing mock interviews in a project in preparation for the real interviews they're going to do with target language speakers. Then I might want to think about, how was your target language use? How well did you use culturally appropriate behaviors? How well did you initiate, sustain, and close the interview? How well did you ask questions? And I'm going to give specific things or performance targets here, which gives them a clear indication of what they have to change in order to move to the next level. So the goal here of this is not just that I'm giving them a grade. The deeper goal is that I am scaffolding process. I am scaffolding their thinking and I am scaffolding their language use by what I have put on this sheet. The last piece is technology and thinking about how are we going to guide students' attention to the specific features of the tool we want them to use. So for example, with the brainstorming tool that I showed you, I need them to see that you can comment on other people's information. I need them to see that they can vote. How am I going to show them that? Is it going to be with screenshots? Am I going to do some kind of a demo? Am I going to give them 5 minutes to click around and then get with a partner and tell the partner all the things you discovered? There are lots of ways to manage it, but I have to think explicitly about what I'm going to have them do. I need to guide the choices that they have to make within the tool and their ability to use the tool to collaborate or to produce creative products. And I need to think about how we're going to share this with a public audience. So whatever our product is, I need to think about how they're going to get there. I'm going to want to scaffold things like search. So I could use a tool like Symbaloo so that I predetermine what search options they're going to be clicking on. I might want them to, might want to scaffold the products. So maybe they're going to create motivational posters. There are tools that will help them create comic strips, digital magazines, flip books that are online, infographics, newspaper creation, storybooks. They can annotate images. They can write collaboratively. So sort of the bottom line is that as I'm thinking through a project, I want to make sure that I am providing just-in-time support for my students. I want to structure activities so that they learn from the doing rather than from my explaining. I want to make sure that the sustained inquiry is the primary focus of each activity. So irrespective of what tools or processes I'm using, my evaluation mechanism should always be, is this helping students to use their language to inquire or to learn more about whatever they need to accomplish the project? And I want them to be thinking about, or I want to make sure that I'm supporting them intellectually, emotionally, and socially. And those are the things that the movie industry scaffolds. As I said, in our next module, we'll be talking about how to scaffold the language pieces. So how do you help students to extract information from culturally authentic texts? How do you help them to communicate interpersonally when they are brainstorming or interviewing or doing the various collaborative processes? And then how do we help to scaffold the presentational communication? So you won't want to miss next time.